Our sermon passage today is found in the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. I'm going to be reading chapter 29, verse 31 through all of chapter 30. So if you would, just please turn there with me, follow along, and I'll read Genesis chapter 29, verse 31 through all of chapter 30. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, "Because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me." She conceived again and bore a son, and said, "Because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also." And she called his name Simeon. Again she conceived and bore a son, and said, "Now this time my husband will be attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi." And she conceived again and bore a son, and said, "This time I will praise the Lord." Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she ceased bearing. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, "Give me children, or I shall die." Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" Then she said, "Here is my servant Bilhah. Go in to her, so that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her." So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went in to her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has judged me, and has also heard my voice, and given me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again, and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, "With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and have prevailed." So she called his name Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. And Leah said, "Good fortune has come." So she called his name Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, "Happy am I, for women have called me happy." So she called his name Asher. In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field, and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" Rachel said, "Then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes." When Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son. Leah said, "God has given me my wages, because I gave my servant to my husband." So she called his name Issachar. And Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a 6th son. Then Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me, because I have borne him 6 sons." So she called his name Zebulun. Afterwards she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son, and said, "God has taken away my reproach." And she called his name Joseph, saying, "May the Lord add to me another son." As soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, that I may go, for you know the service that I have given you." But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages, and I will give it." Jacob said to him, "You yourself know how I have served you, and how your livestock has fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased abundantly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also?" He said, "What shall I give you?" Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything. If you will do this for me, I will again pasture your flock and keep it." Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and they shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later, when you come to look into my wages with you. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and black among the lambs, if found with me, shall be counted stolen. Laban said, Good, let it be as you have said. But that day Laban removed the male goats that were striped and spotted, and all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had white on it, and every lamb that was black, and put them in the charge of his sons. And he set a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob pastured the rest of Laban's flock. Then Jacob took fresh sticks of poplar and almond and plane trees, and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the sticks. He set the sticks that he had peeled in front of the flocks in the troughs, that is, the watering places, where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the sticks, and so the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. Jacob separated the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the striped and all the black in the flock of Laban. He put his own droves apart and did not put them with Laban's flock. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob would lay the sticks in the troughs before the eyes of the flock, that they might breed among the sticks. But for the feebler of the flock, he would not lay them there. So the feebler would be Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys.
Thanks, Amy. Well, we are continuing our sermon series in the book of Genesis together this morning. As John talked about, just picking up right where we left off last Sunday, even as we start meeting together in a new space this week. And so we left off last week at kind of the end part of chapter 29, and so we are picking up this morning right there, 29:31. And so, as we do that, we come to what is really the center of the story of Jacob in the book of Genesis. If you remember, over the last few weeks, we've seen Jacob's conflict with Esau, Jacob taking the birthright and the blessing from his brother through manipulation and deceit. We saw how that led to Jacob having to flee from his home and basically go into exile away from the promised land. But then on the way, God came to Jacob in a dream and assured Jacob that he would give him the promises that he had given to Abraham and Isaac, which, if you remember, we've been summarizing as land, offspring, and blessing all the families of the earth through him. And on top of that, God assured Jacob that he would be with him and protect him wherever he went, that he would ultimately then bring him back to the land. And then last week we saw Jacob's arrival at his uncle Laban's house in Haran, and how Laban deceived Jacob then, giving him a taste of his own medicine, tricking him into working for him for 14 years to marry his daughter Rachel, who Jacob loved, and tricking him into marrying his daughter Leah as well. And so that's what we've seen so far: conflict with Esau, meeting with God, and then arriving at Laban's house, marrying Leah and Rachel. Well, then starting next week, we're going to see how the other end of Jacob's story mirrors what we've seen so far and repeats the same pattern in reverse. So we'll see Jacob leave Laban's house with Rachel and Leah. Then we'll see God come to Jacob and reiterate his promises to him again on his way back into the promised land. And then we'll see Jacob reunite with Esau. And so this section of Genesis then that we're focusing on this morning comes right at the center then of Jacob's story. And it's basically the hinge that the whole thing turns on. And this is a common literary structure in the Old Testament, where you have these parallel scenes or ideas then building to a center point. And that center point, in a lot of ways, then is the point. Everything else is pointing to this. And so the question is then, what is Moses trying to highlight in Jacob's story with this passage being at the center? Well, what we're going to see is that our passage this morning is actually made up of two separate but parallel accounts that each make a very similar point and that work together to make the one main point then that's at the center of Jacob's story. And so the first section of our passage runs from chapter 29, verse 31, through chapter 30, verse 24, and you can see on your handout that what we're going to see in that section is that God multiplies Jacob's offspring in spite of and through sin and superstition. Then in the second section of our passage, which runs from chapter 30, verse 25 through verse 43, we're going to see that God multiplies Jacob's flocks in spite of and through sin and superstition. And what we're going to see through these two parallel accounts is that the whole point of all of that is God's faithfulness. It's really the same point that we've already seen over and over in Jacob's story and that we'll continue to see. Jacob, and in this passage, his wives as well, continue to live as if they have to take for themselves what God has already promised to give them. God promised Jacob already that he would multiply his offspring and provide for him and bless him. But in this passage, Jacob and his wives are going to operate as if they have to take those things for themselves through any and every means they possibly can. And it's fascinating because all through both sections, Jacob and his wives are going to verbally acknowledge that God is the one who provides offspring and blesses them, but then they live and act as if they have to do it all in their own strength and ability, and that basically any means available to them is fair game. But both of these sections are written in a way that without directly telling us that God is the one doing everything behind the scenes, it's clear that every son that's born and every sheep or goat that's born is the result of God sovereignly, graciously, and faithfully keeping his promises to Jacob in spite of and through the ugliness of their sin and the foolishness of their superstition. That reality right there ought to convict and transform not just Jacob, but us as well. Because here's the thing, like a lot of what we're going to see in this passage is so shocking and so strange that the temptation for us is going to be to just look down on Jacob and his wives for their actions. But the thing is, if we're honest, we're tempted by and often guilty of the exact same patterns. And there are so many areas of our lives where this is true, but two that have particularly stuck out to me this week that I've been considering myself are one, just on an individual level, how we find ourselves at the beginning of another year. And it's just a natural time then, in light of that, to evaluate, make changes to certain habits and patterns in our lives, whether that be diet and exercise or finances or school activities, sports, career, even spiritual disciplines. But how in that, often, as we evaluate what we're doing and make changes and adjustments, our tendency is to think that if we just put the right habits in place and do the right things, that we'll get the results that we want. And not only do we do this individually, but also just on a corporate level. As we begin meeting in this amazing new building, we could so easily get caught up in the benefits of meeting in a nice space like this and so focused on what signs and banners we need to get and how to make this room look like ours on Sundays and what things we can do here that we haven't been able to do before and to approach meeting here as if we just do all the right things, we'll get the results that we want. And so the thing is, though, like establishing good habits and patterns in our lives is a good thing. And using this new meeting space well is a good thing. And of course, we would recognize and say that we're looking to God and trusting God personally and corporately. But it's possible to have ourselves convinced that we're trusting in God when we're living and operating as if we're trusting in ourselves. And when we're trusting in ourselves, we will often at least be tempted to do things to try to get the results that we want that are completely inconsistent with what we should do if we're trusting in God. And so in a lot of ways, like this flows perfectly out of Jonathan's sermon last week on control. Like what we're going to see this week is God's faithfulness to keep his promises in spite of Jacob and his wife's continued efforts to live as if they're in control. And we're going to see how that reality ought to convict and transform how we live. So I've already kind of touched on how we're going to do that, but as you can see on your handout there, first we're going to walk through our passage and look at these two back-to-back accounts of God's faithfulness to Jacob, and then we're going to consider two takeaways for our lives today in light of that main point of God's faithfulness to keep his promises. And so look with me then at the first chapter, or at first at chapter 29 here, starting in verse 31, and we'll see how God multiplies Jacob's offspring in spite of sin and superstition. And so again, this first account here runs from chapter 29, verse 31, through chapter 30, verse 24, and it's actually beautifully designed. There are four main sections that each begin with someone seeing. And so chapter 29, verse 31, you have when the Lord saw. Then chapter 30, verse 1, you have when Rachel saw. In verse 9, you have when Leah saw. And then in verse 22, you have then God remembered, which kind of breaks the pattern a little bit, but that word there, we'll talk more about this, is covenant language of God turning his attention to someone to keep his promises. And so right there, you can see then how this whole thing is bookended with God, and then you have the two sisters in the middle, which reflects God's sovereign control over everything that happens with the two sisters in these verses. Not only that, though, but within each of those four sections that those phrases create, the focus alternates back and forth between the two sisters. So in 29, 31 to 35, the focus is on Leah. Then in chapter 3, verses 1 to 8, the focus is on Rachel. Then in chapter 30, verse 9 to 21, the focus is on Leah again. And then in 30, 22 to 24, the focus goes back to Rachel. So in that way, the passage reflects the back and forth conflict then between these two sisters and the struggle between them trying to each get the upper hand by whatever means they possibly can. And then not only that, but the entire section then is also bookended by the phrase, opened her womb. You'll notice that in chapter 29, verse 31, God opens Leah's womb. And then in chapter 30, verse 22, God opens Rachel's womb. And so in spite of everything that happens in between, God is the one who opens the wombs of Leah and Rachel. Like he's the one who ultimately multiplies Jacob's offspring in this passage, just like he promised he would. And so with that structure in mind then, look at chapter 29, verse 31 here. It says, when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So this verse here sets up the conflict that the rest of the passage then follow in the rest of the passage that follows. So we're told that the Lord saw that Leah was hated, and this connects us back to what we saw last week with Jacob coming to his uncle Laban's house, meeting Laban's daughter Rachel, falling in love with her, and agreeing to work for Laban for 7 years to marry Rachel. And if you remember then, though, on their wedding night, Laban swapped out Rachel for her older sister Leah and tricked Jacob into marrying her instead. But then when Jacob finds this out, he tells Jacob that he would give him Rachel as well in exchange for another 7 years of work. So Jacob ends up with both sisters as his wives. And in chapter 29 and verse 30, though, we're told that Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah, which at one level you can hardly blame him. Like he didn't intend to marry Leah. She was forced on him by her father. But at another level, you hear that and your heart just breaks for Leah. Like for her father to put her in this situation where she's married to a man who's also married to her sister and who loves her sister more because he really wanted her for a wife. Like you can just imagine how she must have felt and what her life must have been like. And that's what this word hated there in verse 31 is getting at. It's a little complicated because it can mean hated, but it can also more specifically mean the opposite of loved. And that's probably closer to what this means here. Like, it doesn't seem that Jacob hated Leah in the sense we probably originally think when you hear that word. I mean, we're going to see in the next few verses he has 7 kids with her. That doesn't seem like hatred. But the point is that Leah was not loved the way that a wife should be. Like she's the unwanted wife. She's the wife that Jacob didn't choose and probably wished he didn't have. But the Lord saw Leah. Like he saw her in the horrible situation that she's forced into and in her grief. and he had compassion on her, and he interceded for her by opening her womb. Just remember, like in the context of Genesis, like this is more than just the blessing and joy of having a baby. Or even in this culture, the honor and security that children brought to their mother, which all would have been a part of the desire for children here. But on top of that, like this is all connected to the hope of the promised offspring of the woman, going back to Genesis 3:15. And the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob now, Leah's husband, to multiply their offspring. And so to be used by God as part of the fulfillment of those promises was a sign of God's favor. And to not be able to have children was seen as a sign of being cursed. And that is what we're told about Rachel at the end of verse 31. She is barren. And so this is shocking, right? Like the unloved, unwanted wife, God opens her womb, but the chosen and loved wife is barren. Like it's the exact opposite of what you would have expected. And so all this sets up the conflict in this section. Then you have both the love of their husband and the ability to have children driving a wedge between these two sisters and stirring up this conflict and competition between them. And we see that start to play out then as Leah begins having children. Look at verse 32 here. It says, and Leah conceived and bore a son. She called his name Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. She conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. She called his name Simeon. And she conceived and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will be attached to me because I've borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. And she conceived again and bore a son and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she ceased bearing. So we're told that God saw Leah. He opened her womb. And then we're given these quick accounts of Leah giving birth to not just 1, but 4 sons. And these verses here set up a pattern then that will continue throughout this section, whereas each son is born, we're given their name and then a brief explanation for their name. And so Leah names her first 4 sons names that sound like the words see, hear, attached, and praise. And so you can see then how each of those names reflect the explanations that Leah gives as each one's born. And there's 2 main focuses then in this set of names and explanations. One is how Leah acknowledges that these sons were given to her by God because he saw her and heard her in her affliction and suffering as an unwanted wife. And ultimately then in the end, Leah determines to praise the Lord even in her heartbreaking situation. But notice as well that her hope is that maybe she can earn Jacob's love by bearing him children. And the fact that keeps coming up over and over, that she keeps mentioning that son after son, seems to indicate that it wasn't having the effect that she was hoping for. But for Leah, each of these birds is about more than just having children. Like this is competition for her husband's love. And Rachel sees what's going on here. And she sees that while Leah is getting pregnant over and over again, she hasn't had a single child. So look how she responds then, starting in chapter 30, verse 1. It says, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, give me children or I shall die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. And he said, am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? She said, here's my servant Bilhah. Go into her, that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her. So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. And so Rachel here, she sees Leah having all these sons, and she's not having any herself. And so she confronts Jacob about it. And Jacob gets angry that she would blame him. And his response to Rachel is fascinating because it's theologically true. Like, God is the one who opens and closes the womb. So Jacob really does have no power to give Rachel children like she's asking. But in the context of what we've seen so far in Genesis, rather than praying for his wife like Isaac did when Rebekah was barren back in chapter 25, he blames God. Like, it's not my fault, it's God's fault. And that sounds a whole lot like someone else we've seen, right? Adam, back in Genesis chapter 3. Not only that, but the way that this is phrased here, it hyperlinks us back to Genesis 3 in another way as well. Like Jacob's words here echo the serpent accusing God of withholding fruit from Rachel. And so Rachel is faced with her own moment in front of the tree. Like Eve here, rather than trusting God to give her what's best for her, she decides to take for herself what she desires. And the plan she comes up with is one we've seen before as well. Like she gives her servant Bilhah to Jacob so that she can bear children in her place, on her behalf. And this is exactly what we saw Sarah and Abraham do with Hagar when Sarah wasn't able to have children back in chapter 16. Like rather than trusting God to give them the son he promised, they tried to take for themselves what they desired. And just like in Genesis 3, taking what they should have trusted God to give them caused them all kinds of pain and suffering. But in spite of that, Rachel does the same thing here and gives her servant to Jacob to try to take this fruit for herself. And so this is shocking for us to think about a wife doing this. But at one level, this was a culturally acceptable practice at the time. Like if a wife was unable to have children, it would have been acceptable to give her servant to her husband to have children in her place, and then she would adopt the children her servant bore. And that's what we're going to see Rachel do. But at the same time, Genesis doesn't specifically condemn this or comment on the sinfulness of what Rachel and Jacob do here or what Abraham and Sarah did back in Genesis 16, but this violates the marriage principle of one man and one woman in Genesis 2, and it mistreats and abuses another human being. And the way this is tied to Genesis 3 through the language here implies that this was sinful and wrong. Like this is another attempt to take what God had already promised to give. But it works. Look at verse 5. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God has judged me and has also heard my voice and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali. So Jacob here has two more sons through Bilhah. And Rachel naming them indicates that she adopts them as her sons. And she gives them names that sound like the words judged or vindicated and wrestle or struggle. And so Rachel here sees Dan's birth as vindicating her. Like she's not childless anymore. And she thinks that Naphtali's birth, she's taken the upper hand in her competition with her sister. Well, Leah's not going to stand for that. Look at verse 9. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. So Leah sees what Rachel does in giving her servant to Jacob, and since Leah has stopped having children now for some reason, she thinks, well, two can play at that game, and she stoops to the same sin. Like she gives her servant Zilpah to Jacob as well. And again, it works. Just like Bilhah, Zilpah bears Jacob two sons as well. Look at verse 10. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Leah said, good fortune has come, so she called his name Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, and Leah said, happy am I, for women have called me happy. So she called his name Asher. So Leah gives Zilpah two sons names that sound like fortunate and happy, though Leah's comments here, just the way that she says this, make you wonder how happy she really is. She's clearly winning the baby competition at this point, but there's still no indication that anything has changed in her relationship with Jacob. And so at this point, just in the pattern of things, you might expect the action to go back to Rachel now at this point, and that's sort of what it seems like is about to happen, but then we get a twist. Look at verse 14 here. It says, in the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you've taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? Rachel said, then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. When Jacob came in from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come in to me, for I've hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he lay with her that night. So what in the world is going on here? There are two main keys to understanding what's happening in these verses. One, we have to understand what the big deal is about these mandrakes. And so basically what Reuben found was a plant that was thought to be something between a love potion and a natural fertility remedy. And the thing is, it was completely superstitious, not scientific in any way. But apparently, Rachel and Leah believed it would work. And especially Rachel, who has yet to have any children herself, desperately wants these mandrakes. And so at first, Rachel tries asking nicely for some, but Leah is not going to just give them away, especially to Rachel, which leads then to the second key to understanding what's happening in these verses. The way this is all phrased points us back to another deal that was made between siblings. Not that long ago, an older brother selling something incredibly valuable to his younger brother for something that he overvalued in the moment. Esau selling his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of stew. Now we get the reverse. A younger sister sells a night with her husband to her older sister for a plant. Like, Rachel is convinced that these mandrakes are just what she needs to finally start having children, so she trades a night with Jacob for these mandrakes that Leah's son found. But this time, Rachel's plan doesn't work. Like, it completely backfires. Rachel gets the mandrakes, but Leah gets pregnant. Look at verse 17. God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband. So she called his name Issachar. And Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me because I've borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Afterwards, she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. And so just when we expect Rachel to make a move in the competition again, I mean, she got the mandrakes. Instead, Leah has 3 more children, 2 sons and a daughter, which Leah's daughter, all we're told is that she names her Dinah. And that's all we're told about her for now. But we're going to come back to her in a couple of chapters. The main focus here is on the sons. And so Issachar, the 5th son, she basically says she earned. That's the wordplay in his name. And in contrast, the wordplay in Zebulun's name is that he's a gift from God. And so 1 son earned, 1 son given. But Zebulun's name is also a play on the word honor. And so again, Leah's hope is still that maybe now Jacob will honor her after bearing him 6 sons. And so it's so sad. Like, Leah has taken what seems like an insurmountable lead in the baby competition at this point, but it hasn't won her what she ultimately desired. And it's at this point then that the focus finally returns to Rachel. Like, after all these years, after all these sons, after all this conflict, all the sinful and superstitious ways that Leah and Rachel have competed for Jacob's love, we're told in verse 22, then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. So now we come full circle. God doesn't just see Rachel, he remembers her. And this is the same phrase we saw in chapter 8 when God began to act to keep his promises to Noah in the ark. God turns his covenant attention to Rachel and begins to do through her what he promised to do for Jacob. He opens Rachel's womb, and she finally has a son. And she names him Joseph, which is a play on both taken away, because God has finally taken away her reproach of being barren, and he's done it in a way that she has to acknowledge was all him. And it's also a play on add, reflecting her prayer that God would give her another son. So all of that then is the first account of God's faithfulness to Jacob. And do you see the point? Like, at one level, this entire account is the story of sin and superstition. Leah being unloved and mistreated. Leah and Rachel's conflict and competition for Jacob's love. And Leah and Rachel mistreating and abusing their servants for their own benefit. Rachel selling Leah a night with Jacob for a superstitious fertility remedy, and a whole bunch of sons born in the process. But if you're familiar with this story going forward, like the original audience of Genesis would have been, you would recognize that all the names of the sons born in this account are very meaningful. Like, they're the first 11 of the 12 tribes of Israel. Like God is forming his covenant people through all of this sin and superstition. And that's exactly the point. Like in spite of and through Rachel and Leah and Jacob's sin and superstition, God was faithful through all of this to multiply Jacob's offspring just like he promised. And we're going to see the same thing in the other section of our passage. Only this time, you can see on your handout here, the next section focuses on how God multiplies Jacob's flocks in spite of sin and superstition. And there's really two main parts to these verses. Verses 25 to 34, we see Laban and Jacob's agreement. And then in verses 35 to 43, we see Laban and Jacob's actions. And what we're going to see in this section is that in the first part of the passage, both men are going to try to negotiate a deal that's in their best interest with every intention of taking advantage of the other one. And then in the second part of the passage, both men immediately take action to manipulate the situation to their own advantage with no concern for the other. But through all of it, we're going to see again that God is the one who blesses Jacob and those who bless him, and who protects Jacob from those who would try to harm him, just like he promised he would. And so look at the first section here at Laban and Jacob's agreement, starting in verse 25. It says, as soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wives and my children from whom I have served you, that I may go, for you know the service that I have given you. So it seems like the birth of Joseph here coincided with the end of the 14 years that Jacob had agreed to serve Laban. And so Jacob's time is up and he's free. And it seems like he feels like he's been in Haran long enough. Hopefully Esau has cooled down by now and he's ready to take his wives and children and go home. But Laban doesn't want Jacob to go. Look at verse 27. Laban said to him, if I have found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages and I will give it. So Laban here, he's saying that he knows that the Lord has blessed him because of Jacob. The phrase there, I've learned by divination, if you have an ESV, you'll notice that there's a footnote there that says that phrase could also mean I have become rich. Likely that's the better option here. Like Jacob is going to make the exact same point in the next few verses. God has done exactly what he promised. He has blessed those who bless Jacob, which, I mean, with Laban, I guess you have to define bless pretty loosely, but that's the point. The point is Laban has become rich, and he realizes it's because of Jacob, and he doesn't want to see Jacob leave and take that blessing away with him. So he offers Jacob a contract extension and basically tells Jacob to name his price. And so look how Jacob responds in verse 29. It says, Jacob said to him, you yourself know how I've served you and how your livestock has fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased abundantly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now when shall I provide for my own household also? So Jacob here, he's basically saying, you're right. You had very little before I got here, but it has increased abundantly because I served you well, and the Lord blessed you through everything I did. But Jacob said, I've got to provide for my own family at some point, and so he puts an offer on the table. And this is going to sound a little strange to us, but we're going to talk about what Jacob is offering here. Let's kind of read through this first. He says, verse 31, he said, what shall I give you? Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. Like Jacob's not asking for a gift, he's asking for a paycheck. And so he says, if you'll do this for me, I will again pasture your flock and keep it. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and they shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later when you come to look into my wages with you. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, shall be counted stolen. Laban said, good, let it be as you have said. So the key things to understand here about the deal that Jacob is offering Laban are that sheep were white and goats were black, and that sheep or goats that were speckled or spotted were more rare and were seen as blemished and unwanted. And so what Jacob is offering to do is to clean up Laban's flock by taking out all the blemished, unwanted animals and to actually make Laban's flock more valuable by keeping the blemished animals out of it in the future. And he's offering to take then the animals that Laban wouldn't want anyway as his pay. And he says there's an advantage to this. Like, it'll be easy to tell at a glance whether I'm keeping the deal or not, because if you ever see any solid color animals in my flock, it'll be obvious that I stole them from you. And I love how Jacob presents himself as such an honest guy here. I mean, like, that's funny. We know Jacob well enough at this point to know that the only reason he would offer this kind of a deal is if he has some plan to turn this thing to his advantage. But the point is, at this point, he's offering Laban what sounds like an incredible deal. And Laban jumps on it. He's like, that sounds great. Let's do it. And so that's their agreement. Laban and Jacob's agreement is that. Let's look at verse 35, then we'll see Laban and Jacob's actions then after their agreement. Verse 35, but that day Laban removed the male goats that were striped and spotted, and all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had white on it, and every lamb that was black, and put them in charge of his sons. And he set a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob pastured the rest of Laban's flock. So we're not surprised by this at all at this point, but Laban immediately breaks the deal that he and Jacob just made that very day by going through his flocks, taking out all the striped and spotted animals, and giving them to his other sons to take care of, and sending them a 3 days' journey away so there's no chance of them mixing again. So he thinks he's really turned things to his own advantage here. Like, he's leaving Jacob a flock of white sheep and black goats to tend for him. And there's nothing for Jacob to take as his own to begin with. And there's no striped or spotted animals to breed with the solid color animals to produce striped or spotted babies. So Laban thinks he's got Jacob cornered into working for him for little or nothing now. But look at what Jacob does then. Verse 37. Then Jacob took fresh sticks of poplar and almond and plane trees and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the sticks. He set the sticks that he had peeled in front of the flocks in the troughs, that is, the watering places where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the sticks, and so the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. And Jacob separated the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the striped and all the black in the flock of Laban. He put his own droves apart and did not put them with Laban's flock. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob would lay the sticks in the troughs before the eyes of the flock, that they might breed among the sticks. But for the feebler of the flock, he would not lay them there. So the feebler would be Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys. And so this is all just as strange and superstitious as the Mandrake thing in the last section. Like, Jacob comes up with this plan to get white sheep and black goats to breed striped and spotted babies. He takes sticks with dark bark and white wood and peels stripes and spots into the sticks. And then whenever the animals are breeding, he puts the striped sticks where they will see them as they're breeding, as if that would convince them to produce striped offspring. And so I'm no expert, but that's not how it works. But that's only part of his plan. He's shrewd about when he does this. That's what the rest of this is talking about. He waits for the stronger animals to be breeding, to put out the sticks, and when the weaker animals are breeding, he doesn't put out the sticks. And so his plan in all of this is to breed a flock of strong, striped sheep and goats for himself, and to breed a flock of weak, white sheep and black goats for Laban. And the crazy thing is, verse 39 and 43 says that it worked. Like, the sheep and goats had spotted babies, and Jacob increased greatly and had large flocks. And not only large flocks, but male and female servants and camels and donkeys, which ought to sound familiar because it's almost exactly the same as the description of Abraham's wealth that he gained in Egypt back in chapter 12. And that's really the point of this whole thing. Like, in spite of all the wheeling and dealing and finagling and manipulating and sin and superstition and crazy ideas with sticks to try to breed his own flock, God is ultimately the one who is faithful and blesses Jacob and multiplies his flocks and protects him from those who had tried to do him harm, just like he promised he would. Like, that's the only explanation for how what Jacob does here works. That's the whole point of these two accounts at the center of Jacob's story. Like, Jacob continues to live as if he's in control, and as if he has to take what God has already promised to give him. But in spite of, and even through Jacob's and his wife's sin and superstition, God is faithful to Jacob and keeps his promises to Jacob. He multiplies his offspring just like he said he would, and he blesses him and protects him just like he said he would. Every son that was born and every striped sheep and goat that was born should have reminded Jacob of that. The thing is, there's no indication in our passage this morning that any of this got through to Jacob yet. That's coming, but it's a few chapters away still. But at this moment, doesn't seem like it got through to him yet. But I am praying that the Lord will use what we've seen here to convict and transform us. And there are so many potential applications from this passage for our lives today, but there are two in particular, just as we wrap up this morning, that I think are the main point from this passage. And so let's look at this as we finish this morning. Two takeaways for our lives today. First, and this is really the main point of all of this, is that nothing can thwart the promises of God. Like, do you see how that's the ultimate point in these two accounts? Like, just think of all the obstacles to God keeping his promises that we've seen throughout these verses. Mistreatment, suffering, broken, dysfunctional marriage, family conflict, repeated sin, superstition, barrenness, being taken advantage of, attempting to do things in their own strength. And remember, in the overall storyline of Genesis, like every one of the promises God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are part of his plan to fulfill the promise to undo the curse brought about by the fall in Genesis 3. So there are major promises at stake here. And every one of these obstacles feels like a serious threat to God keeping his promises. But none of it caused God to even bat an eye. Instead, both of these stories become illustrations of what we see in Isaiah 46, 9 through 11. God says, I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will accomplish all my purpose, calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my counsel from a far country. I have spoken and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed and I will do it. Like nothing can thwart the promises of God. And Jacob's sons and Jacob's sheep are proof. And this is such good news, like not just for Jacob, but for us as well. Because the same promises that God made to Jacob are the same promises that we are waiting for the ultimate fulfillment of. Like the offspring promised to Jacob wasn't just the sons born here. It was Jesus. That's what we've seen all along the way through the book of Genesis. The land promised to Jacob wasn't just a place in the Middle East. It's a new, restored creation in the new heavens and the new earth. And the ultimate blessing promised to Jacob for all the families of the earth is that all who are united to Jesus by faith will live with him forever in the new heavens and the new earth when he returns. Oh, but not only is our hope in the fulfillment of the same promises, the same obstacles that we see all through this passage are some of the same things that feel like threats to God keeping his promises to us as well. But no matter what threats to God's promises in these two accounts resonate most with you, whether it's being mistreated and taken advantage of, whether it's suffering, whether it's repeated sin, whether it's family conflict, whether it's trying to control things you can't ultimately control, like whatever it is, you can rest assured that none of that can thwart the promises of God. He will accomplish all his purpose. He has spoken and he will bring it to pass. And this passage reminds us of that reality, which leads to the second takeaway, and it's this. The rock-solid certainty that God will keep his promises changes how we live. Because God is faithful and he will keep his promises, how we live should fit with and be consistent with that reality. And it's in this way then that this passage functions not just as a reminder of the faithfulness of God, but as a negative example of what our lives should not look like because of the faithfulness of God. And so as we read through these two accounts, knowing that nothing can thwart God's promises and that he's faithful to keep his promises ought to make us think like, what are you doing? Like, you don't have to do that. That doesn't make sense. Like, that's completely inconsistent with the reality that God is going to give you what he promised to give you. Oh, but sometimes we need stories like this that stir up those kinds of thoughts in our hearts so that the Lord can then turn the spotlight on us and say, that's you. Because how often are we characterized by the exact same attitudes and actions that we see in Jacob, Rachel, and Leah in these verses? Discontentment, conflict, competition, superstition, manipulation, using others for our own ends, taking matters into our own hands. All of those things are completely inconsistent with the reality that God is faithful to keep his promises. And yet, all too often, those are the attitudes and actions that characterize us. We need passages like this to help us look honestly at our own lives and think, what am I doing? That doesn't make sense. That's completely inconsistent with the reality that God is faithful and he will keep his promises. Because what attitudes and actions like these reveal is a heart that's trusting in self rather than trusting in God. And the remedy our self-focused hearts need is this reminder that God is faithful and he will keep his promises. And when that reality begins to control our hearts, it will transform how we live. Instead of discontentment, we will be characterized more and more by faith-fueled contentment. Philippians 4:11-13, I've learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Instead of conflict and competition, we'll be characterized more and more by faith-fueled patience. 1 Peter 2:23, when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Instead of taking matters into our own hands, we'll be characterized more and more by faith-fueled prayer. 2 Chronicles 20, verse 12, for we are powerless against this great horde that's coming against us. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you. And none of that means we just sit back and do nothing. Instead, we'll be characterized more and more by faith-fueled work. 1 Corinthians 15:10, but by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Like, that's how the rock-solid certainty that God is faithful and that he will keep his promises transforms how we live. It turns our hearts from trusting in ourselves to trusting in God, and our actions then align more and more with that faith. Oh, and that's the reminder that we need as we begin a new year and as we begin meeting in a new building. We don't have to live as if everything depends on us. In fact, to do so is completely inconsistent with the reality that God is faithful and he will keep his promises. So let's let this passage open our eyes to where our attitudes and actions are inconsistent with that reality. And where we need to, let's confess those sins and superstitions to the Lord. Let's meditate on his faithfulness, and that he will keep his promises. And that will transform us more and more into individuals and into a church that are characterized by faith. Let's pray. Father, thank you for putting us in this passage this morning. In a lot of ways, it's not a passage we would have thought of for our first Sunday in a new meeting space. But Lord, you're sovereign even over that. And we trust your hand even in the timing of where we are in the book of Genesis. And so, Lord, it's a strange passage in a lot of ways. It's a difficult passage in a lot of ways. But it's a reminder that we need to hear that through all of these things, through all of these obstacles, you're faithful. You're sovereignly in control. Nothing can thwart your promises. You will accomplish all your purpose in spite of and through sin and superstition and everything else that we saw in both of these two accounts. And that's in so many ways what the story of Jacob reminds us of over and over and over again. And we need to see it because we need to see how we are tempted to live the same way, Father, individually, personally, especially as we begin a new year and as we're just thinking about our habits and patterns and even thinking about implementing new ones. Lord, guard us against ways that we might be tempted to look to ourselves, our own strength, worldly wisdom, just putting the right habits and patterns in place to get the results that we want. Lord, guard us against that, but help us to not just swing too far the other way where we don't do anything, but Lord, help us instead to be characterized by faith in all these different ways. Faith-fueled contentment, faith-fueled patience, faith-fueled prayer, faith-fueled work. Lord, just pray that you would change our heart posture to being one of dependence on you, complete reliance on you being faithful, you keeping your promises, and then working and living in obedience and consistent with that reality. Father, help us as a church as well when it comes to this, as we begin meeting in a new space, to guard against any attempt to do anything in our own strength, to think that by putting certain things in place or putting certain programs in place or adding new things that we can do anything, create anything, get whatever results that we want. Lord, make us a church that's completely dependent on you and that operates that way, that everything we do would be fueled by faith, would be consistent with your faithfulness, and that you're the one who keeps your promises. And so, Lord, remind us of all these things this morning. Convict us where we need to be convicted. Help us to repent where we need to repent. And Lord, all of this, just continue your work through this book in our lives as we continue to study it week by week. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.